Stivers. See you. How's it going? Good. We got votes, right? Yeah, we might get. Okay. Understood. No, these guys. Yeah. Okay. So we think it'll start at 2:30, right? Okay. Okay. Good. Good luck with that. Sure. I'm good. Okay.
Runde. Hello, everybody. The subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record, subject to length limitations in the rules. Good afternoon, and thank you to my colleagues on the subcommittee and the panel for coming together to discuss the future of U.S. economic engagement. And I got to give a shout out to Mr. Engel, the ranking member. He's in financial services, and they've got 15 votes teed up, ready to go, so he'll be here as soon as he can. President Trump has just returned from his first trip to the Asia-Pacific, a region the White House has taken to calling the Indo-Pacific region. The long trip, which began on November 3rd, is the longest trip to Asia by an American president in more than 25 years, and a fitting reminder of the importance of the region to American interests. Going forward, the trip will surely be an inflection point for the U.S. policies towards the region. One of the most important aspects of this policy will be our economic engagement, which is what we've gathered to discuss here today. The discussion about U.S. economic engagement in Asia frequently centers on trade, but the Asia-Pacific is still a developing region, and too often the discussion does not give sufficient attention to what the United States must do before trade. The important development and trade promotion work that is a precursor to robust trading relationships. The United States already has the tools needed for this important work. U.S. development finance institutions, OPEC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the USTDA, which is the U.S. Trade and Development Agencies, and others leverage private investment to promote development and economic activity abroad. These institutions are increasingly important because their work is in line with a larger tectonic shift in how capital moves in the developing world. Over the last few decades, private capital has outstripped assistance from donor governments to constitute 90% of financial flows into developing countries. Deepening U.S. development finance authorities will make foreign assistance more effective by working with this trend rather than against it. A model focused on public-private partnerships would also be more sustainable in times of budgetary constraints. Development finance institutions frequently operate at little or no cost. OPEC remitted $239 million to the U.S. Treasury in fiscal year 2016. And finally, a development finance-based approach is rooted in U.S. national interests as well, promoting U.S. business abroad and opening up new export opportunities for U.S. industries. Despite these advantages, development finance is consistently undervalued as a part of overall development assistance strategy. To begin to remedy this, I've introduced the Economic Growth and Development Act, which would create a one-stop shop for private sector participation in overseas development, and I'm currently working on more expansive legislation that would consolidate, reform, and improve U.S. development finance mechanisms. I hope that the panel will share with us today their own recommendations for improving our development finance efforts. While U.S. economic engagement in Asia adjusts, China's economic engagement strategy, known as One Belt, One Road, or more recently, the Belt and Road Initiative, is well underway. The Belt and Road Initiative itself is a development finance undertaking, a multi-trillion-dollar response to the substantial unmet infrastructure needs of the Asia-Pacific region, designed to build roads, bridges, ports, and other infrastructure across Eurasia and the Pacific and Indian Oceans to increase China's economic connectivity with the nations who have joined. While infrastructure investment is desperately needed across the region, there is more to the Belt Road Initiative than meets the eye. Though China has promoted the program as generous win-win assistance to its fellow developing nations, the Belt and Road seems motivated primarily by self-interest. Belt and Road projects are financed by Chinese institutions at high rates not typically found in the development context, conducted by Chinese corporations that are often state-owned enterprise, utilize Chinese labor and material, and seem to add little to local economies and can bring unsustainable debt burdens. The program also seems to closely align with China's strategic and military interests to be more than just mere coincidence. In one illustrative example, China built an economically unviable port in the hometown of Sri Lanka's corrupt former leader, converted its interest to equity when Sri Lanka could not service the resulting debt, and now owns a port along its maritime energy supply route through the Indian Ocean. In contrast, U.S. development finance efforts can offer an alternative that is healthier for the region while furthering our own interests. U.S. programs have the high standards and transparency that Belt and Road projects often lack and are demand-driven by market forces, not state-owned corporations and military strategists. So as we discuss U.S. development finance in Asia today, it'll be helpful to do so in the context of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and I hope the panel can discuss how U.S. efforts can counter the potential negative aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative. Without objection, the witness written statements will be entered into the hearing, and I now turn to the ranking member. Mr. Deutsch, do you have a comment you want to say? Okay. And with that, we are thankful to be joined today by Mr. Daniel Runde, the Schreier Chair and Director of the Project on Prosperity and Development at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Mr. Rory Campenhausen, Senior Vice President for Research at the National Bureau of Asian Research, and the Honorable Jonathan N. Stivers, a Commissioner of the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission and former Assistant Administrator to USAID, our U.S. Agency, International Development Bureau for Asia. And with that, we're going to start with your testimonies. You guys know how the buttons work and the timers and all that. That's good. Mr. Runde, if you will, let's hear your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. I hope to use my time to talk about two things. First, the changed world in which we find ourselves, especially in Asia. Simply put, China is eating our economic and diplomatic lunch in Asia. Second, the critical role that enhanced U.S. development finance capabilities can play in countering Chinese economic influence as part of a larger U.S. economic strategy for Asia. We need to take a series of concrete steps as the American government so that we can continue to lead and have an ability to shape the future. My bottom line is that the Congress can take a series of steps to strengthen OPIC and other bilateral and multilateral instruments of American power. Congress should spend its limited political and policy time on strengthening and reforming the institutions we already have, including multilateral institutions, and take USAID's Power Africa model and apply it to different sectors in Asia, including power and infrastructure. I believe the United States will get much more benefit out of a reformed and strengthened OPIC compared to a merger of government offices and agencies. Let me talk about changed Asia. While recognizing the great diversity across the continent, it is safe to say this is not your grandparents' Asia. Asia is much freer, is more interested in trade and foreign direct investment, is rapidly urbanizing and aging, needs to close a massive infrastructure deficit, and wants a deeper partnership with the United States around science, technology, and innovation. We need different approaches in Asia. We also need to understand what China is doing, because China is a full-fledged soft power competitor to the United States. China has over 3 million young people joining its workforce every year. Employing so many young people every year is a real issue for China. China's need for jobs and access to alternate trade routes has necessitated the creation of a new model on different terms, one built on quick, one-stop-shop financing and one that leverages its state-owned enterprises. China also has displayed a willingness to periodically overlook human rights, environmental, or social standards in the way it approaches these things. The One Belt, One Road initiative is a prime example of a Chinese effort that leverages all aspects of this model described above. It's also, frankly, a good idea. Recreating the old Silk Road land roads, cutting transit times for goods and services would be an economic boon. We cannot stop One Belt, One Road, nor should we. The United States and its allies should instead seek to influence the soft infrastructure of One Belt, One Road, and I've submitted some documents for the record about that. Let me move to development finance. Let me first define development finance institutions. Development finance institutions are government or quasi-government institutions that provide equity, loans, or other financial support for private sector projects in low and middle-income countries. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation is the United States DFI. DFIs are not a solution to all of our challenges in Asia, but they must be part of a larger economic and political strategy for Asia and the developing world. DFIs are powerful and precise development tools, and DFIs are one reason that there's been a massive expansion of cell phones, for example, in Africa and Asia. In the late 90s, no normal investor believed that there was a mass consumer market for cell phones. DFIs provided the capital and provided a demonstration effect that others could make money in the African cell phone sector. As I said, though, DFIs are not a solution for every problem, and they cannot do things that grants or technical advice or diplomacy can do. DFIs usually need a private sector sponsor, a business partner. They provide money in the form of a loan. They sometimes take a minority ownership position or provide highly specialized advice. DFIs need clear rules of the game. They need some level of security and a functioning state. They often, there's things that USAID and MCC provide that DFIs can't. And there are things that USTDA and export credit agencies like US Exim Bank provide that DFIs cannot. So what are we to do about all this? Well, I think there's several things this Congress should be doing. The first is that the Congress should ask the administration to produce a U.S. economic strategy to go with our national security strategy. Second, I would recommend that the Congress work with the administration to provide the following enhanced instruments for OPIC. OPIC is not permanently authorized. It ought to go to a 10-year authorization. Congress needs to raise OPIC's ceiling of total investments that it can make. It's currently $29 billion. It should go to $58 billion. OPIC ought to be able to keep some of its profits. OPIC ought to create a funding stream for early-stage financing for innovators and entrepreneurs in developing countries. We should dilute or remove the U.S. content requirement, especially in U.S. national security priority countries. OPIC needs a limited amount of what is called equity authority, basically the ability to make minority ownership stakes in a small number of projects. And OPIC should dilute or even remove its so-called carbon cap. This carbon cap puts a limit on carbon emissions related to the totality of the project financed by OPIC. President Trump was just in Vietnam and talked about doing more projects in Vietnam with OPIC. The carbon cap will hold back OPIC's ability to work in Vietnam and other countries that are not the poorest of the poor. Development finance capabilities will only get us so far. We need to do a lot more in trade. I know this is important to you, Chairman. We need to make sure that the trade facilitation agreement gets done in Asia. We need to provide the money for it in the 150 account, and then the AID and our diplomats at the State Department follow through on that. That's a win-win for the United States and for developing countries. Fourth, regarding AID, and I know I'm running out of time, that we should take lessons from the Obama era's Power Africa and apply it to Asia. We also need a strategy for exiling middle-income countries, and I would encourage AID to return to the use of enterprise funds. Regarding TDA, it's one of the best and most efficient agencies in the U.S. government, does a series of things, highly leverages its money, but I would seek a larger congressional appropriation for TDA. I would not merge it with OPIC for a series of reasons in that they don't overlap almost at all. I can answer questions about that. Sixth, regarding the U.S. Exim Bank, we need a fully functioning Exim Bank. It's completely absurd that we don't have a functioning Exim Bank. Currently, you can only approve deals of only $10 million. There's currently $30 billion in U.S. Exim Bank applications waiting right now. This is crazy. Seventh, our bilateral agencies and our multilateral agencies need to move much more quickly and in a coordinated way. Japan's aid agency and its DFI have reduced their door-to-door approval of infrastructure projects to 11 months in response to AIIB and the Chinese, and so should we. Eighth, and I'll stop here, with regard to multilateral development banks, we need to rethink about how we use the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. The Asian Development Bank is a great asset of the United States. If they were to come to us for a special capital increase, I think we should consider it. I believe this committee ought to consider doing hearings about the United States and the Asian Development Bank. I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate your input on that, and those are all great points, and I look forward to hearing more about that. Mr. Camphausen, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Good.
Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I'm a China guy, and so my role is to talk about the Belt and Road, and I'm basing my comments largely on a recent monograph that we published at NBR, and glad to provide a copy to you, Mr. Chairman. Since the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Chinese leadership has had two overwhelming foreign policy goals. One, the restoration of what China considers as its national domain and boundaries, and two, the restoration of China's historical position at the center of Asia as the preponderant power in the region. These two restorations are really the heart of what President Xi Jinping in China has called his China dream for the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation, which he hopes to fulfill by the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC in 2049. And so, understood in the light of China's longstanding foreign policy goals, the Belt and Road Initiative is, I believe, an early test case which offers us a glimpse of the sort of integration under Chinese-led norms that Beijing would like to see emerge in Eurasia. The Belt and Road Initiative is very important to the Chinese leadership. As mentioned by the chairman in his opening statement, more than $1 trillion has been dedicated, at least in principle, to funding projects. President Xi Jinping is personally engaged, including making an appearance at the Multinational Belt and Road Forum in May of this year in Beijing. And the Belt and Road has been written into the Chinese Communist Party charter in the most recent 19th Party Congress. It tells how important this initiative is to the leadership. As an overview, the Belt and Road Initiative sets the general long-term direction for China and seeks to mobilize and coordinate the use of all available national resources, political, economic, diplomatic, military, and ideological, to pursue both internal, in terms of economic development, and external, both strategic and national security objectives, in an integrated way. And so I'd like to focus on how those three areas, economic, security, and strategic, really come together from Beijing's perspective. On the economic side, one way to think of the Belt and Road is as a new Chinese stimulus package, similar to that introduced after the 2008 global financial crisis, and it's intended to sustain Chinese economic growth, the development goals notwithstanding. The crucial difference is that this time the activity will take place outside of Chinese territory, and in effect, the plan is to export some of the overcapacity that developed as part of the response to the 2008 global financial crisis. From a security angle, in the near term, Belt and Road has significant potential to increase China's military footprint in the region, Central Asia and beyond, in an effort to secure China's periphery, a central goal of the Chinese leadership. The geographic scope of BRI extends over regions that together form an arc of instability, where the security situation can be volatile due to a variety of factors, including ethnic and religious violence, territorial disputes, and destabilizing spillovers. And finally, on the strategic side, the Belt and Road Initiative is a way to secure China's periphery, address internal security challenges, those which have international linkages, and I'm thinking primarily of terrorism here, and to respond to the Chinese perception of a challenge from the United States. Chinese authorities believe that by providing economic development, they'll help secure China's most restive provinces in the west of China, which have connections to international terrorism originally in Central Asia. More broadly, at a strategic level, Belt and Road reflects Beijing's regional and global ambitions. It is an instrument to consolidate China's position at the heart of Eurasia, in a space where U.S. influence is rather limited. The initiative is intended to counter what Beijing perceives as the U.S. unacceptable containment of China off of its eastern seaboard. So how does the Belt and Road actually expand Chinese influence? Very briefly, China portrays itself as the magnanimous provider of public goods through development projects and proposes a list of possible areas for cooperation under the umbrella of Belt and Road, and then urges other countries to get on board China's train of development. It offers material incentives in the form of investment, infrastructure projects, and general economic and security benefits to members that choose to take advantage. But in return, it expects that recipient countries will tacitly agree not to challenge China's core interests, criticize its posture, or seek to change its political system. But there are some predatory aspects of Belt and Road, and I'll end with these just by ticking them off. First, the bidding process. Not at all clear that there is any evidence of a competitive bidding process for projects. State subsidies. China's loans are in reality state subsidies for Chinese companies to build infrastructure with Chinese materials using Chinese workers. Third, it's not really a development effort. Only 23% of the Chinese aid funding falls under the OECD's definition of aid, mostly given to projects without a development intent and that have a grant element of under 25%. Debt burden for host states, and the chairman referred to this in his opening statement. Loans can be financially unsustainable for poorer countries, over 6% in many cases. Sri Lanka, for example, owes 10% of its debt to China. Who gets the jobs? Xi Jinping has said since Belt and Road was launched, more than 180,000 local jobs have been created, but there's no transparent record of that. Who gets the revenue? Revenue generation formulas from infrastructure projects are completely unclear. For instance, Pakistan will reportedly receive only about 9% of the revenues from the terminal and marine operations at the new Gwadar port. And then there is endemic corruption, environmental impacts, economic leverage that China poses on countries that fall under the program, and so forth. So in conclusion, I would submit that just because we in the West may not have fully grasped what Belt and Road is all about, it does not make the initiative foolish, unimportant, or doomed to fail. For now, China has the initiative, and its projects under Belt and Road have gained an undeniable momentum. But Beijing's plan to reshape the economic and political map of Eurasia is still in its early stages, and there will be many obstacles on the road ahead. The United States can and must come up with a comprehensive strategy to better defend our existing order in ways that serve our own national interests. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Stivers, if you would.
Thank you. Chairman, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. It's an honor to be back before this subcommittee, especially alongside such distinguished colleagues. Before I begin, I'd like to make clear that the views I express today are my own and not necessarily to be attributed to the U.S.-China Commission. This morning, the bipartisan U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, on which I serve as a commissioner, submitted to Congress its 2017 annual report. The Commission is tasked by Congress to examine the national security and foreign policy implications of the U.S. trade and economic relationship with China. This year, we spent some time analyzing the One Belt, One Road initiative. We conclude that China is expanding its presence on the world stage through both coercion and a charm offensive, thereby creating pockets of influence, leverage, and control. The charm offensive is typified by One Belt, One Road, which seeks to bring in more than 60 countries into China's economic and strategic orbit. It is time for a new U.S. economic and development strategy for the Asia-Pacific region in order to effectively compete with China's growing influence and investment. In my view, the discussion about U.S. economic engagement in Asia has been overly focused on trade policy. This new strategy should prioritize development financing and our foreign assistance tools, some of our greatest strengths, in a strategic way, coordinated with our allies and partners, in order to advance our national interest in a stable, prosperous, and democratic Asia-Pacific region. The Asia-Pacific region, which I include India in that, is absolutely vital to the security and prosperity of the American people. It's the most dynamic and one of the youngest and fastest growing regions of the world. U.S. companies invest more in ASEAN and its members than our investment in China, Japan, and India combined. And they're responsible for over 500,000 U.S. jobs, and it has tremendous potential for future U.S. exports. In the coming years, the countries of this region will play an increasingly pivotal role in world affairs. The question isn't whether, but how the Asia-Pacific region develops. And the type of development will make all the difference, and there are different competing models out there. While the U.S. is consumed by a lot of other issues, China is not only investing in becoming a high-tech powerhouse, which our annual report describes in much detail, but it's also placing itself at the center, strategically and economically, of the fastest-growing region of the world. China's One Belt, One Road initiative includes about $900 billion worth of projects, mostly financed by the China Development Bank. The state implicitly guarantees its debt, and its assets dwarf those of the World Bank and other multilateral development banks. Key aspects of China's development model include, first, relieving China's overcapacity in its slowing industrial and construction sectors of its state-owned enterprises. In short, as has been said earlier, China builds the infrastructure with its own materials, its own workers, and sends the recipient country the bill for it later. Less planning is devoted to the impact or the sustainability of these projects for the country and its impact on the people. Second, expanding China's access to strategically important maritime and overland trade routes. Page 3 of my written testimony shows these routes in a nice map. Third, gaining influence and using its new economic leverage to coerce other countries. Fourth, taking advantage of low standards on transparency and leading to a higher debt burden for developing countries. And while the international community and this Congress pursued debt relief for poor countries 2 decades ago, China is now reburdening these countries with predatory loans that create dependence on China. China often uses the term win-win to describe its economic activities, but Asian officials sometimes joke that win-win usually means China wins 2 times. While Asian governments generally want Chinese investment, they would prefer more competition and higher quality options. In many cases, Chinese investment has sparked backlash because its development model is exclusively focused on helping China, and it often facilitates corruption, displaces communities, and harms the environment. it would be expensive for the U.S. to compete with China dollar for dollar on building infrastructure in Asia. But due to the limitations of China's development approach, it isn't necessary. The U.S. can compete with China for fewer dollars and greater effectiveness if our resources are used in a strategic way. And so I would submit the following recommendations. I have 7 of them in my written testimony, but I'll mention a few here. First, economic and development assistance to the East Asia-Pacific region should be significantly increased. Currently, the region only receives 3% of all non-military U.S. foreign assistance. These low levels ensure that efforts to compete with China and Asia are vastly underfunded. And making matters worse, the Trump administration budget request included a 46% cut to development assistance in the region. The best way to compete with Chinese investment is to provide the needed resources to increase our competitive advantage in what we do the best: global health, fighting pandemics and infectious diseases, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, food security, environment protection, governance and rule of law initiatives that promote stable economies and democracies. These development initiatives are tremendously successful, but without the resources, we simply can't adequately help shape this all-important region. Second, the U.S. should provide stronger support for institutions that are best positioned to compete with China on infrastructure. Last week in Asia, President Trump stated he would support additional infrastructure development in Asia. Unfortunately, these announcements are not consistent with his budget request, which zeroed out OPIC, reduced funding for the World Bank, and cut the U.S. contribution to the Japan-led Asian Development Bank in half. It's my understanding that the Trump administration is considering some sort of larger development financing reform, and I'd be happy to have a discussion about that in more depth with my colleagues and with the members. But in short, I would say bringing our development institutions together under one agency that improves coordination is a lot better than creating yet another development agency, a bureaucracy with an independent commission. And then third, as opposed to China, the U.S. has strong allies and partners in the Asia-Pacific, and we should double our development efforts to empower those counterweights, namely India and ASEAN. We should assist India with gaining membership to the Asian-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, support Prime Minister Modi's Act East policy, and help India with its own domestic development challenges. And in addition, a strong and unified ASEAN has the potential to push back on China, and the U.S. can help the ASEAN Secretariat become more effective. And also on Taiwan. Taiwan has a new southbound policy as it seeks to diversify its economy. And Taiwan has a lot to bring to the table with good development practices and a democratic model. We should be finding ways consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act to coordinate and utilize those resources for both Taiwan and the U.S.'s larger goals. So in conclusion, Beijing's main advantage has been that for the last 2 decades, the U.S. has diverted its focus from Asia while pursuing other challenges. The U.S. can no longer ignore the strategic competition that's underway in the Asia-Pacific region, and the challenge now is for the administration and Congress to develop a more effective strategy to compete with China and make sure it has the resources to be successful.
I appreciate everybody's testimony. Great, you guys are spot on, and I look forward to this because it's so important, as you brought up. Ms. Stivers, you brought up how we've kind of pivoted from the Asia-Pacific over the last decade or so. The last administration had a strategic patience where we were kind of just spectators on the sideline, and we can't afford to do that. And China has run with the One Belt, One Road initiative. My records show that they've invested over $4 to $5 trillion in the last decade. And it's an investment in the future. You know, it's an investment in the future of their development and trade and things like that. We need to make sure that we're at the table. And, you know, the thing that concerns me is after the 19th Party Congress in China with Xi Jinping, he was quoted as saying, China should take center stage in the world, adding that no one should expect China to swallow anything that undermines its interests. And we just did a Codell, and we were in Vietnam, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And while in Hong Kong, I reiterated these words, and I brought up, these words sound threatening towards America's interests. Proposing China wants to supplant America's leadership and knock us off the world stage. This will not be tolerated. If China cares to share the world stage with us or any other world powers, we'd be willing to do so. And then I asked them, please convey that message to Beijing, which I'm sure it was. The important thing is their initiative, like you brought up and the members of the panel brought up, they're investing in hard assets. They haven't learned the soft power. And all you have to do is look at their past history, how they treated Hong Kong with the 50-year transition of the agreement. They're not living up to that. How they treated South Korea when South Korea asked to have a THAAD system for their own security. China retaliates against South Korea instead of North Korea and does economic damage to South Korea. The bottom line is it makes these countries, if America's presence is not there economically, in trade, or in military support, these countries are looking, and they're not wanting to, but they're going to pivot closer to China. And it's not just South Korea, it's the ASEAN nations. And we've had the privilege of meeting with all the ambassadors from those nations. And it was interesting because we just had our 50th year anniversary of ASEAN, our 40th year for our involvement with that. And I asked them, why has ASEAN been such a successful pact? And they said it was because of America's leadership. And so when coming back from this trip from that region, everybody said they want us back, it's important that we're back, and they want to focus on trade and the initiatives. So my question is, how should the significant capital infusions brought to Asia by the Belt Road Initiative affect our decisions in the future? The one thing that we can do that I don't think China's quite gotten there yet is the relationships that we build, that as we invest in the country, we want the best for that country. You know, and I think it's been brought up by the panel that, you know, it's win-win, a double win for China. That was pretty good. But about the allocations of our development assistance, which would you recommend? And you brought up about combining these agencies. We've got a bill that is looking at that. Mr. Camphausen, you were talking about streamlining it, and our bill will streamline that whole process. And we'll share that with you in due time. But Mr. Stivers, what would you do different as far as our aid?
Well, I mean, in terms of like a reorganization, I'm not sure that the different development agencies need to be combined into one. My worry, from my standpoint, and also having worked at USAID, is that it's so difficult to coordinate across agencies, even the State Department and USAID. It's a challenge to coordinate and make sure we're working from the same page. And so when you have 10, 12, more than that development agencies, it's very hard for the administration, it's very hard for our country to compete with China, which is a top-down authoritarian model, which can just decide, you know, which path they want to go, and everyone goes in that direction. So creating more agencies and more bureaucracies, I don't think anyone wants to do that. But unfortunately, that's been done in the past because it's so difficult to try to do any kind of serious foreign aid reform. And I know this committee has worked on that issue and hasn't been able to get there because it's so difficult. And so again, my fear is that we would create another one that would make it more difficult. And so you can streamline or combine certain agencies at one point, but there does need to be, I believe, more centralization in terms of our foreign assistance.
Mr. Camphausen?
Very quickly, I think we want to make sure that we don't convey to countries that desperately need development aid that the U.S. is opposed to aid for them because it comes from China. I'll share an example.
Agreed.
Each year I have the privilege of briefing a delegation of Pakistani generals that comes to our National Defense University, so twice this past year. And on both occasions we've talked about the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is an important part of the Belt and Road, $42 billion worth of planned investment in 4 types of projects, mostly energy. And Pakistan is desperately in need of more energy. And it came out in the course of the discussion, one of the generals finally said, it sounds to me like your problem with CPEC, and I don't have a problem with CPEC, but your problem, America's problem with CPEC is that it's Chinese in origin. And so you have, your strategic competition with China is making us a bill payer if you oppose it too strenuously. And so we need to be very clear that we're not, that the penalty is not paid by countries that desperately need the development aid.
I appreciate that. And, you know, the thing is, it's not against China, you know, because I wish them the best of luck, but it's not at our expense. And I'm going to go to Mr. Ted Deutsch from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Stivers, you said that President Xi is expanding China's presence on the world stage through coercion and a charm offensive. So I'd like the 3 of you to talk about that, One Belt, One Road, and how it works, how the investments lure countries in, they welcome the investments, obviously, and how that turns into coercion. How does that play out? Please, Mr. Runde.
Thank you. Let me just first say that every country I visit in Asia, they want more America, not less America, to your point. I would just make one other point, then I'll respond to your question, Mr. Deutsch, in that I think there are fewer and fewer poor countries in Asia. If I think about this subcommittee's footprint and where you think about countries, as I said earlier, this is not your grandparents' Asia. And so over the next 10 years, you're only going to have one or two or a handful of countries that are going to be eligible for IDA, meaning that the poorest, the softest loans from the World Bank. And so what that means is that the kinds of things that they want from the United States and from the rest of the world aren't going to be traditional foreign aid. There are going to be pockets of poverty in those countries, but in many ways, those countries ought to be able to fund and finance much of the sort of the basic human needs. And I think that's one of the reasons you've seen the uptake of things like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Every member of Congress I've ever met knows what the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is. They all know what it is. They don't like it. I don't necessarily like it either, but that it reflects, I think, the fact that what I say is that if we don't meet the hopes and aspirations of countries, they will take their business to the Chinese. And I think the hopes and aspirations of countries in Asia are changing and evolving, and we need to change with their hopes and aspirations. And we should really,
I'm sorry,
Yes.
since you brought it up, we'll get back to this if we have time, but since you brought it up, let's talk about the Asia Infrastructure Bank.
yes.
So there's this investment bank that's been created. Most of our allies, our European allies, have joined. We have not. So I understand that people tell you they don't like it, but was it a wise choice? Does it continue to be a wise choice for us to not be a part of that? Because when you talk to the Chinese, they'll tell you all they're trying to do is make these investments to help develop the area.
I think that we ought to be strengthening the institutions that we built as a result of the rule-based international order, things like the Asian Development Bank. We have my view is that we ought to be strengthening the Asian Development Bank and strengthening our bilateral instruments first. I have a very hard time imagining that any administration would come to the U.S. Congress and ask for several $100 million to put into a Chinese-led initiative. I have a very hard time imagining that it would even be politically feasible. I'm not necessarily sure I'd want to do that either. I'd rather work on a whole series of other things first before even contemplating that. And regarding your question regarding One Belt, One Road, I think that it goes to my point about meeting the hopes and aspirations. It's actually a good idea. If you actually can cut the travel time across the Eurasian landmass, this is a great accomplishment. It's a good thing to do. I don't think we can stop the One Belt, One Road, and nor should we try to. But what we should be trying to do is influence the soft infrastructure around the One Belt, One Road. I've written a report that I'm submitting for the record about the soft infrastructure of the One Belt, One Road. Things like, how do we use the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development? How do we use the Asian Development Bank, the two regional development banks that will most, we should have them be financing infrastructure projects along the One Belt, One Road. We should work to have, there was a discussion about, we didn't talk a lot about this, but there's an obscure topic, but I think an important topic around the issue of government procurement. Most of the decisions about buying railroads or building bridges or building airports or power are often in the hands of government procurement officers in developing countries. I know this seems like an obscure topic, but it relates to American jobs and American business, and just bear with me. I know it's a little obscure, but in essence, we have told developing countries for 50 years to use one rule book that has go with the lowest bid and lowest bid procurement. And if we go with lowest bid procurement, because they're the cheapest, the Chinese are winning on low bid procurement. In the last 5 years, we've been able to change the rule book at the World Bank, which is the de facto set of standards for procurement in the developing world, to use a concept called life cycle cost. It's the kind of thing you use when you buy.
Right. I appreciate that. We don't have a whole lot of time, but I appreciate that. But I want to ask, the soft infrastructure and changing the rules, we're way into the weeds. Big picture, China's making massive infrastructure investments. And the way you describe it, it looks like we're trying to sort of pick up the scraps. I mean, Mr. Stivers, what do the Chinese think that they're getting from it, and how do they turn those investments into political power?
China is using they're using a charm offensive with OBOR, with these projects, but they're using economic coercion after that. You see this in all places in Asia. Some of the democratic openings that have happened in the region, whether it's in Burma or Sri Lanka, there's been a direct China component to that, where you have countries have responded negatively, and there's been backlash to certain projects. We've talked about Sri Lanka. I think the chairman mentioned it in his statement. In Burma, the Mitsoni Dam was a huge dam that was built I think it's part of OBOR now. I think China puts everything as part of OBOR in terms of its projects, but they didn't do any kind of environmental or social assessments, deeply unpopular in the country. This is a country and a people, a proud people that don't want to be dependent on China. And so you have countries who are, there's significant popular backlash, if not the governments, all over the region. Just real quick on AIIB, I really don't think the U.S. should be joining it, first of all, because we don't have a couple $100 million to contribute to it. And second of all, we don't know if AIIB is going to be an instrument of Chinese foreign policy yet. We don't know if they're going to have high standards of development yet. And I think being on the outside and holding our membership as a possibility while our other countries are inside of it trying to maneuver is a better place for the United States to be in regards to AIIB. And just third of all about that, AIIB has only lent $2 billion, which is a small number compared to as much financing is going on. And China still retains 26% voting power in AIIB, and I'm not sure we want to be a part of that yet.
The gentleman's time
Appreciate
has
it.
expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair will recognize himself, the acting chair, at this time for 5 minutes. The president just got back from a almost 2-week trip to the region of the world that we're discussing here this afternoon, and he once again used a term that I wouldn't necessarily use, but I'm not president, so he gets to say what he wants, but it's kind of America first, and he said, well, all countries consider themselves first, and clearly China's attitude is really China first, and you gentlemen testified to that earlier when you talked about the deal, what you get when you enter into one of these mega projects or even a smaller project with the Chinese. You do get Chinese money, but you get Chinese workers and you get a Chinese asset and overall Chinese profits, and they're pretty much there probably forever for the most part. What do the other countries by now, do they realize, you know, what they're getting when they jump into bed with China on one of these mega projects? Mr. Stivers, did you want to?
I think some do, some don't. I think, and we talk about this a little bit in the U.S.-China Commission, our annual report. Some countries like Thailand are more economically advanced, very strong middle-income country, and they are able to push back on China on a lot of these projects. But you have a country like Burma, who they don't have the expertise to analyze a lot of the details of these very complicated infrastructure deals. They don't know what they're signing up for in terms of these loans that they're getting. And I think that certain countries know what they're getting into, and they negotiate in a very tough way with the Chinese. Others of them don't have the leverage to push back in many cases. And so I think that some of the work that USAID does to help these countries improve their governance, improve their capacity to analyze economic deals. A lot of this, I guess we call it soft power, but it's some of the really good work that we do can really help these countries push back on things that will harm their country in the long term.
Thank you. Let me go to another area here. TPP, unfortunately, became a campaign issue in the last race, and both sides, and I don't want to get too political here, but the Democratic candidate in particular, who had a history of being basically pro-TPP, because of Bernie and a lot of his supporters, ended up getting dragged way to the left on this and ended up being against it, and Trump was pretty much always against it, I think. So you had both major candidates being against it. And I think to some degree we've marginalized ourselves as a result of that, and now China is much more in the driver's seat because of our absence from that. What can we do about it at this point? I know the President's talked about he doesn't believe in regional trade agreements. He wants bilateral trade agreements, and I've met a number of times with some of his people about that and their optimism for accomplishing that. But are there any suggestions you gentlemen would make to the administration on how they can actually move forward with that, if that's their philosophy? Mr. Camphausen?
Very quickly, in my own discussions with representatives from Japan's METI, I think they think in very sophisticated terms about whatever we do in terms of our bilateral deals, have them being TPP ready for the future point at which common sense might prevail, and we'll see the need to return to a multilateral setting. So the Japanese even use the term docking station, where a bilateral agreement could then, if you imagine a space shuttle kind of setting, actually merge back into what TPP has become. And I think there's a lot of value to that. We don't want to sacrifice the standards. We want to have them TPP level standards, and so that at that future point, they can potentially be joined back in.
Mr. Runde?
Thank you. I would encourage this subcommittee to hold hearings on prospects for a U.S.-Japan bilateral free trade agreement. I think to the point Mr. Camphausen was making, I think we need to think about Lego building blocks for coming back. I'd like to see us return to something like a TPP. I think and as well, we need to take a look at trade and investment agreements across Asia. And we should start with our close allies and emerging economies of ASEAN. If it sounds a little bit like TPP, well, maybe there's something to that.
Thank you very much, and I'm almost out of time here, but let me raise one, and I'll toss this to you, Mr. Stivers, since you brought it up, and that's Taiwan. I happen to be one of the founders of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus and have been there 10, 11 times, something like that over years, very, very involved with Taiwan. And they have been interested, obviously, in a bilateral trade agreement with us, or being in TPP, or even prior to us discussing TPP. They want to be more involved in this, and obviously the PRC does everything possible to suppress Taiwan because they consider them a territory and all the rest. What can we do? What should we do to make even closer our relationship with one of our key allies in the region, Taiwan, whether it's trade or other things? I know getting into the military is probably beyond the confines of this hearing, but anything you'd like to say relative to Taiwan?
Absolutely. I mean, Taiwan has so much, they have so much resources, so much expertise when it comes to global health, when it comes to development. And they have this new southbound policy, so it's in their interest to diversify away from China, their dependence on China. So you have a confluence of interests here, and of course the Southeast Asian countries, they want Taiwan's economic activities. And so you have a confluence of interests here. And I think that, I didn't include this in my testimony because I haven't really thought this out in too much detail, but if there are ways for, consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act, for our entities, for our government, to help Taiwan join some of these, obviously the international organizations, which you're a big supporter of Taiwan joining, but if we can do some more things bilaterally to help them do what they're already trying to do. I think they need some help diplomatically with some of the inroads in these countries. And again, they have so much to offer. And can I mention TPP for a moment? As a member of the Obama administration, I was always concerned that TPP was not enough as an economic component of the Asia rebalance. Whether you're for it or against it, the Asia rebalance needed a better economic component to it. And also, not every country in Southeast Asia liked TPP. A lot of the countries were worried about losing market share to Vietnam. And so this is not something that everyone in Asia wanted, except for China. But more groundwork needs to be done in the region so that these countries have the standards where they're able to enter into a high standard agreement. Vietnam needs a labor sector. They don't have that. They don't have free association there. And there's the beginnings of that now, but not at a point where I think we can connect them to our economy and meet the high standards that TPP set out.
Thank you very much, and my time has expired. Mr. Barry, if you would allow me just a couple seconds here to say one last thing. I'm going to give you additional time, too. It's not like there's others chomping at the bit to get into this. So. But I would also just put in a pitch here for legislation that I've introduced along with some of my Democratic colleagues, and that's the Taiwan Travel Act. Right now, the high leadership of Taiwan, President, Vice President, Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, cannot come to the United States. One of our strongest allies, they can transit through the U.S., but we can't meet in our nation's capital, for example, with others that are essentially, it's a de facto country. It's not a country in name, but it functions as a country. It has for a half century, and it's a democracy. They freely elect their officials, unlike the PRC. PRC can come here. They get red carpet treatment. Our close ally, the president, can't come here. 26 members had to fly up after votes some years back to meet with President Chen Shui-bian in New York City after votes one evening. And we got back like 3 o'clock in the morning because we couldn't meet with him here in our nation's capital. It's disgraceful. It's a slap in the face to our close ally, and we got to change that, and we need to pass that legislation. So thank you, and I'm off my rant now, and I will now recognize the gentleman from California for as much time as he wants.
Well, thank you, Mr. Shabbat. And thank you to the witnesses. I'm sorry I missed your opening statements out of conflict, but if I just think about the post-war, post-World War II world order, it was a U.S.-led world order. And in many ways, the U.S. leadership in helping rebuild Japan, helping rebuild Europe, helping, answering the call to protect South Korea and helping rebuild South Korea, and the way we approached the world in the last 70 years made the world a more prosperous place, lifted a lot of people out of poverty, and made those 70 years much more peaceful than the prior 70 years when 2 world wars and endless conflicts occurred. So for us to start to withdraw from the world is a big mistake. And, Mr. Shabbat touched on pulling out of TPP. As a Democrat that supported the deal, I do think in our lifetime this potentially is our biggest foreign policy blunder. And because when we think about trade and engagement, it's not just about commerce and economic activity. We're also thinking strategically of how you, and that is very different than how the Chinese necessarily think about this. We think it's a good thing to help other countries develop their infrastructure, develop values intrinsically within their own country of what democracy looks like. It does create competitors for us, but that's not necessarily a bad thing either, because it also creates markets for us to sell our goods and services. The next 70 years may be a slightly different world order. It may not be America going alone. And I actually think it won't be an America alone. It will be America working with partner nations that share similar values of democracy, of free markets, of opportunity, of human rights, working together. And I was in Japan a few weeks ago at the Mount Fuji Dialogue, and we were talking about that. And you brought up how do we preserve TPP, or at least one thing that we discussed with Prime Minister Abe as well as the Diet members. They all get that they're going to have to keep moving forward, and we've seen the TPP 11 countries moving forward in this past week. But they also very much want the United States to re-engage. And there's a clear message, and if any of those TPP 11 countries are watching or listening, keep that deal intact. Keep as high standards as possible intact, because I have to believe 2 years from now or 4 years from now or some point in the near future, we will realize that we have to do business with some of the most vibrant economies in the world. Our businesses, our farmers, they're all realizing this very rapidly, and they've got to talk to their workers. They've got to talk to the folks here back home. By losing those markets, it doesn't mean those jobs are coming back here. It means we're going to have trouble selling our goods and services there. Once we lose market access, it is very hard to get that market access back. So we do have to have a real conversation about trade and the impacts of trade here domestically, but also the fact that 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States. I would put our workers up against anyone else's workers. I'd put the quality of our products up against the quality of products that China's making, and we will win. And we shouldn't be afraid of that competition as long as it's a fair playing field. I also am very critical of how China approaches things. Where we approached it in a benevolent way, wanting to lift those other countries up, China approaches investment in these other countries in a very China-centric way. there was a member of Congress who was in Thailand recently and was traveling on a beautiful brand new road in Thailand and mentioned to the cab driver, hey, this is a great road. And the cab driver said, yeah, the Chinese built it. And they said, oh, you must feel great about it. And he said, no. They came here, they brought their workers, they built the road, and they left. They didn't do anything to build that sustainability, to help Thailand build. And that is a fundamental difference in how we engage in the world and how the Chinese engage in the world. And those Asian nations recognize that. So it's incredibly important. You said I could go on as long as I wanted. So I think it's incredibly important. I get we have domestic issues that we have to address here. We have a lot of folks that are being left behind, but it's incredibly important for us not to withdraw from the world and to stay engaged in a different way. If there were, one or two things that we as Congress ought to focus on, given the current political realities right now, and maybe we'll just go through down the line, to not necessarily counter One Belt, One Road, because I also think the Asian nations know they have to do business with China and they don't want to be considered a pawn in between China, but to offer an alternative to One Belt, One Road. What would those things be? And maybe we'll start with you, Mr. Runde.
Thank you, Mr. Bear. I broke my neck from nodding my head in agreement with everything you said. Thank you very much for your comments. Sir, I think that this subcommittee has, I think, an opportunity to use its platform to, I think this has been a very important conversation. I really appreciate you all convening this. I think that every country I go to, they want more American engagement, not less American engagement. The second thing is, I think that we need to work as closely as possible with our allies. I agree with you, Mr. Berra. I think our first conversation in Asia should always be with Japan, a great ally who wants to work with us on these issues. Obviously, we always want to work with Australia, who's been with us in every conflict since World War I. And then, of course, India and South Korea and Taiwan, a great nation as well. So I think we have lots of friends and we should use them. The other thing I would just say is that the world's not going to wait on us. When we have fights, internal fights between the Congress and the executive branch on things like the IMF quota reform, which is an obscure topic, the Chinese said, I have $2 trillion in the bank, I'm going to start my own bank. The AIB was a direct result of our disagreement in the United States of getting an obscure topic of the IMF quota reform. They will not wait for us. If we don't meet the hopes and aspirations of countries, they're going to turn to China. It's not necessarily because they want to, because it's the only game in town. So we have to offer a counter narrative, a counter alternative. A mix of that are things, yes, like trade. I do think, like I said earlier, I think we should be beginning a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement discussions. I think that's a start. But I think we should look at other allies and how do we deepen our trade and investment relations. Let's start with on a bilateral basis, given that that seems to be what the Trump administration's preference for the moment. But then we need a strengthened OPEC. We need a larger OPEC. We need a strengthened USTDA. We need a functioning Exim Bank. It's absurd that it's not fully functioning. I'll stop there, sir.
Well, I too agreed, Mr. Bear, with almost everything you said, with perhaps one amplification. The Chinese absolutely think in terms of Belt and Road and their broader set of investment and development initiatives as having a strategic orientation. Chinese are intent to avoid direct confrontation with the United States, on the one hand. On the other, they are also equally intent on building their own comprehensive national power in ways that would at a future point allow them to challenge us. So the first point is to absolutely understand that we are in a strategic competition with China now and to behave accordingly. The second is that we can sometimes in our system take that first point and, as a policy response, blame China for what it has accomplished. And this plays very poorly in the region. It sounds a lot like sour grapes and a country that's in great power decline. And so we need to pair a constructive message with an accurate assessment about the competition that we're in. And then the third point is, my two colleagues who are experts in the field have talked about the institutional streamlining that we need and can and need to do in order to make our delivery of development and investment aid more effective, and I think those make a lot of sense. And the last point is just an observation. we're still early in the process of what China is becoming. And to the point about the cab driver observing that the Chinese had done it and left, in a broader sense, there's still a lot of questions about Chinese staying power once they've initiated and completed projects, or even not completed projects. And so there's an opportunity for us there as well.
I would say that I think strategic competition is the right frame for China these days. I mean, we talked about a responsible stakeholder, and we tried to get China to be a better player and to work better with international institutions through the years. They are pursuing their own interests, and they're not going to deviate from their own interests, no matter how much we want to try to influence them to go a certain direction. And so understanding that, it is a strategic competition, and we have to recognize that, and we have to make sure that what we do best, which I think is development. I think this country, USAID, is the preeminent development agency in the entire world. We do global health better than anyone. We do infectious disease better than anyone. We do education. We do food security. We do disaster relief better than anybody. Humanitarian assistance. Nobody can compete with the United States on these things. But we don't have the resources to do them at a high level. So we're not even funding what we do best. We don't need to start building infrastructure in Asia. The U.S. doesn't need to do that. But we should support the institutions that do that. And Japan and Korea and others, the Asian Development Bank in particular, they need to be well-resourced, and they haven't been.
Thank you, gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, sorry about this. First, it is the Financial Services Committee that decided to have 20 roll call votes, just as this group was meeting. Second, I want to make the point that this is not a zero-sum game. We want people in the world to live better. Development is good, and if China will make that happen, that's helpful. But China is not for the really giving aid. China is selling infrastructure on favorable financing terms. That isn't aid, that's loans, and if the projects are not helpful to the country's economy, it is a lose situation for the country. And if the project is so bad that the country can't find a way to pay the debt, then it is a lose-lose situation for both the Chinese banks and the developing country. From a standpoint of our global relations, trade is good. But for the standpoint of our economy, trade is good when it's balanced or even favors us in the trade balance. I think it was my first quarter here back long ago. I had hair, I was new. And the USTR testified that if we could sign an agreement that increased our exports by $1 billion and increased our imports by $2 billion, that would be great because it would be $3 billion of additional trade. That's not the policy we should have now. Looking at China's road and belt, some of these have had setbacks, both financial and logistical. It'll be interesting to see how viable it is. Second, we need to see whether it hurts our interests. It may hurt our national security interests if China is obtaining naval bases in particular, or bases from which they could do intelligence gathering. Third, how is this all going to be financed? It's not aid, it's sales, and seems to be more analogous to the Import-Export Bank than to USAID, maybe halfway between OPIC and the Export-Import Bank. So how can we deal with infrastructure? First, we've got the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank. We've got our direct foreign bilateral aid. I've mentioned OPIC, which doesn't really cost us much compared to what it's able to finance, but exists to help development as much as it does to be an arm of our economy. And then the flip side of that is the Export-Import Bank, which is primarily focused on building jobs in the United States, but also finances infrastructure and development. And then we can do joint ventures with others in the, what's the new term, Indo-Pacific region. I'm going to have to learn how to pronounce that quickly. I should note that our annual funding of OPIC and the Asian Development Bank is about $100 million each. In contrast, China's doing several billion dollars. Also, our bilateral foreign aid to Asian countries is not large. It was $1.3 billion for South Asia and East Asia, and a similar amount if you look separately for Afghanistan, Pakistan. About half the aid goes to economic development, the other half for social development, health, education. And I will want to look at aid in particular areas, and I'll kind of preview the questions and then I'll ask them, believing that I've got not only an opening statement but time to ask some questions. I'll want to look at Pakistan in the sense of whether an appropriate amount of our aid is going to the non-Urdu speaking areas, particularly Sindh. We'll want to ask whether Burma should be getting any aid of any kind, given their treatment of the Rohingya. Speaking of the Rohingya, are we doing enough to help Bangladesh deal with the hundreds, I believe it's 500,000 refugees? So let me first ask Mr. Stivers, are we doing enough to make sure that a proportionate part of our aid in Pakistan goes to Sindh? I realize you're no longer getting a paycheck focused on that. You've left government, but I'll still ask you the question.
I'll have to defer the Pakistan question. Pakistan's not in my
I understand.
wheelhouse,
Do
so
either
I
of the other
apologize.
two witnesses? Then that'll be a question for the record for whoever wants to respond. Who wants to respond to the issue? I know we're not giving much aid to Burma, but should we be giving any, given their treatment? Mr. Stivers.
Yeah, I was hoping I wouldn't be asked that question today, because I worked at USAID. I was the assistant administrator of the Asia Bureau, and we worked very hard on the democratic reform that we had there. And we spent a lot of money empowering civil society in terms of running the election there. Very proud of the steps that country had made. It's extremely disconcerting, the issues that have happened with the Rohingya and the ethnic cleansing or genocide or whatever the appropriate term is. I think that the administration has taken some real steps and put some real resources into helping the refugee community in Bangladesh. I can't think of a worse country for refugees to go to than the most densely populated, one of the poorest countries in the world. And there's no question that Bangladesh does not have the capacity to handle this kind of influx of people. And so I think that I don't think you can think of a higher number that Bangladesh would need to improve conditions for these people there.
Does anybody have a recommendation as to what, I call it a supplemental appropriation, obviously it wouldn't be a separate bill, but how much more should the United States be giving to Bangladesh to focus on the refugee issue? Does anybody have an opinion?
I don't think Congress can come up with a high enough number, to be honest with you. I think as much as Congress could do, because the needs are infinite. The needs are infinite.
I understand.
But
I want to go on to Sri Lanka. What examples where we have a limited return on Chinese infrastructure investment, such as a seaport related to debt problems? What lessons should we learn from some of the financial difficulties of the seaport development problem in Sri Lanka? Does anybody have any focus on that?
I mentioned earlier that the two big democratic breakthroughs that have happened in the Asia-Pacific region have been in Burma and Sri Lanka over the last few years, and both have a direct China component to it. Two countries where there's been a popular backlash to Chinese investment on projects, on major obor. We call everything obor now, but two major Chinese projects. And I think I think Burma opened up their country because they didn't want to be dependent on China, and I think Sri Lanka, it was a similar situation. And I think that goes to show the power of backlash to Chinese projects. And I think that's important to watch. And I think it's a sense of how much concern there is in the region about dependence on China.
The flip side of this is the effect it could have on China. The sovereign debt of more than half of the countries China is targeting under the One Belt, One Road program are not rated as investment-grade securities. Chinese lenders are nevertheless extending tens of billions of dollars of credit toward the One Belt, One Road projects. If those projects fail, or if there's a default in the loan, could there be a effect on Chinese banks that is significant enough to affect the U.S. economy? And in general, does China guarantee its banks against loss on these loans? Mr. Stivers.
Yeah, in terms of the China Development Bank, they do guarantee their assets, and China's lost a lot of money on these projects. Venezuela is a great example. China's losing a lot of money with the situation there in Venezuela, but authoritarian governments, this is a state-driven enterprise, so they're not trying to make profits necessarily. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. They have foreign policy objectives and domestic economic objectives, which we talked about. Those are the priorities, and if they take a loss somewhere, they withstand it.
I'll just add a comment, because I know you'll just be, on questions about southern Pakistan, you'll be responding for the record, but the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the Pakistani component of the Belt and Road Initiative. It is seen in Pakistan's Sindh province as a strategic partnership between the Pakistani Armed Forces and Beijing to exploit Sindh's resources, particularly coal in the Thar region, and it causes a repression of local Sindhi voices of dissent against either the projects or injustices in general. And of course, in Sindh, we've seen a number of disappearances. So for the record, if you can give us some guidance on what our policy ought to be with, it seems, the Pakistani Armed Forces turning over resources from Sindh to China without any without any beneficial impact to the local people. So I'll wait to read your answer on that. I want to thank the chair for indulging me, and will not mention the name of the chairman who delayed me for 45 minutes without consulting with Mr. Yoho.
They're just not their etiquette is not as nice as ours here. No, I appreciate your input, because you always come well prepared, and I appreciate your input into that. We're about at the close, if you can bear with me for a few more minutes. When we look at that ASEAN nation, that whole region, we all know there's 630 plus million people there, $2.5 trillion in trade. And we have pivoted our strategy, but it's time, and we're seeing a pivot back. As we traveled to South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Singapore, everybody's saying how bad it was that we pulled out of the TPP, and I reminded them that, not that we can vote on it in the House, but the Senate wasn't going to pass it, and candidate Clinton said she was not going to approve it. I think President Trump did a very smart thing, getting rid of it early. And while we were over there, we were promoting FTAs with every country we went to. Vietnam, of course, Singapore has a great one. South Korea has one. We mentioned it to Japan, all the other regions in there, Hong Kong and Taiwan, to have free trade agreements, to bolster our presence and the caliber. And the thing that people said that they want more than anything is rule of law, respect contracts, respect intellectual property, and that's what they're not getting when they see these other countries. And being with a construction background somewhat before I was a veterinarian, what I saw were a lot of buildings being built where people built shopping malls. They built infrastructures, but they couldn't maintain them. And so I think your recommendations is, I applaud China for doing what they're doing, and I think we ought to tag along and build businesses there and pick up the pieces. as we do other investments in those. And like my last question, and you guys can weigh in on this, in 2016, about a quarter of OPEC projects were in Asia. Is this an appropriate allocation, and should OPEC be funding more investments in Asia? Mr. Runde?
Thank you, Chairman. I want to first say I completely agree with you. We need to be thinking about our trade and investment relationships with all of our allies in Asia. I don't know, sir, if you were in when I said this earlier, but I encourage us to have a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan as well, and I hope this subcommittee will host a hearing on a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan.
I think you'll see a resolution coming up in the not-too-distant future.
Thank you, Chairman. So I think that OPEC is one of our greatest tools. It's not well understood. I'd like to see OPEC, we've written, for the record, a number of reports about OPEC and how to use it better. I certainly think that we should be spending at least 25% in Asia, and I think if we're thinking about, I think we have to look at Asia not only as an economic and business opportunity for the United States, and China looks at Asia as an economic and business opportunity for them. We should be doing the same, and I do think that we should have at least 25% of our portfolio of investments from OPEC in Asia. I do believe that's the case. I think we should be thinking about more, not less.
Anybody else? Mr. Campenhausen, you said that the Belt Road Initiative is China's stimulus initiative, increases China's military footprint. It's a way to secure China's periphery and a way to consolidate China's initiatives and investment. And I think it's a smart business move for them. But I just think, again, going back to Xi Jinping's comments after the 19th Congress, I think that shows their strategy. And, you know, with the ASEAN nations or any of the regions in that area that we decide to do FTAs, what I would see is a structure, and I had mentioned this, and I guess you guys mentioned it too, about have countries being able to plug in and out. You know, if we're in agreement, kind of like a Lego block model where they plug in and they just build upon that. And if a country where members say, you know, it's not working, you need to leave, they can be removed too. And I think that's something that we need to look at as we revamp how we do foreign policy, how we do our trade agreements. And what I can assure you is there are going to be some strong initiatives coming out on economic growth and development aid and the restructuring of some of these organizations to streamline them. We're requesting more money when we roll these out to be put in there because this is an investment in our future, and we want to focus on national security, economics, trade, and cultural exchanges. Go ahead, Mr. Campenhausen.
If I may offer a quick comment, since you raised the topic, it's clear that this is an experimental field for the Chinese as they think about how they secure the Belt and Road.
Yeah.
And there's at least 3 different models that they're thinking about. In Pakistan, they're essentially outsourcing the security problem. So they're funding the fielding of essentially a Pakistani army division to secure the Belt and Road projects. That's one model. And it works. The Pakistani army is an effective and coherent force, and so it makes sense in that context. The other 2 are perhaps a little more sketchy. One is to essentially take demobilized PLA troops, because China has been in the process over the last several years of demobilizing its armed forces, downsizing, I should say, taking those troops and then making them private security entities. And we understand the challenges we've had with that system. Imagine the Chinese trying to implement a coherent approach to that. The third is to look at even more hybrid forms of security and really imagine that the problems will sort themselves out and leave them to the industries or the companies that are managing them themselves. My broader point is to suggest if we were to think in a forward-looking way, consistent with your view that there are pieces that we might need to pick up and make sense of, a lot of this could go south. The Chinese bets about how to secure their own initiative might not work. They've not done this before. And there are potentially not obligations we might sense, but there are opportunities that we might be in a position to respond to it, consistent with our own goals.
Go ahead, Mr. Stivers.
There are some major changes going on in the Chinese economy now. They're rebalancing they're trying to rebalance their economy from going from this export-led dynamo to a consumption-oriented economy. And I would argue that when they do these OBOR projects and they export these raw materials, this overcapacity, what that's doing is propping up these inefficient state-owned enterprises and delaying real reform in their economy. And I think that's really bad for the United States, because this is they are not opening up their economy to the United States, and that's why I don't worry so much about trade issues in terms of vis-a-vis China, because China's not going to sign some major trade agreement. They're not opening up their economy. And I think by going down this road with the way they're implementing OBOR, it's delaying reform, and it's delaying a lot of the needed reforms that their economy needs to make that would be good for China and the U.S. and the world economy.
One quick question, and I have a statement. What funding levels would be needed for an effective development institution? Just real quickly.
So I believe OPIC does about $4 billion a year. I'd like to see it do double that amount. As I said earlier, we need to raise the credit card limit on OPIC. If we USTA does about $70 million a year in terms of what the Congress allocates it. I would double that. And then I think we ought to be thinking, I think that we ought to be, so I'd say it's not necessarily about additional there's only marginal appropriations, but the Congress has it in its power to put its foot on the gas in terms of giving additional authorities and strengthening these institutions that already exist.
Anybody else? You guys brought this up, and so I got to comment on that. China's new at this, in the development. They've been around for a long time as a nation, as a culture. We can't hold a candle to that. But the thing that we do have is 241 years of developing a nation, trade, and working in a market economy. And there's a lot of trials and tribulations that we have learned over 241 years. And I think it'll work out well. We will not allow ourselves to be supplanted from the world stage. And appreciate your input. Look forward to sharing our bill with you when they do come out and get your feedback on it. With that, this meeting is adjourned, and thank you for your time. All right, gentlemen.